Hi everybody, thanks for joining me for this discussion on relics. In front of me on this table, you'll see that we have a collection of some of the artifacts that we have recovered in the last year. If you're familiar with our show, you know that we explore and metal detect the mountains of Washington State in search of history. These pieces represent a snapshot of daily life in some of the pioneer and logging camps of the area from mid-1800s up into the early part of the 20th century. River's a little bit under the weather today, so without further ado, welcome to Detecting Our Past with Half the Cast. So when you talk about logging in the Pacific Northwest in the mid 1800s, even up to the early 1900s, this was all kind of a free-for-all up here. So essentially you just get a few of your buddies together and go cut down some big trees. There were no government regulations. There were no large companies that were taking out lumber in those early days. It was all about freelance. So going out into the woods, cutting down a few of these trees, floating them down to the river, to the central ports of trade like Seattle, and then San Francisco from there. So it wasn't an organized effort in these camps, and some of the items that you see here today are going to be quite surprising. Let's get into it. So these are cool. These are files that we found, iron files. You can tell that they're so rusted and corroded that you can only identify it by the shape. And we find them in the flat shape, and then we find these, what they call rat tail files today. I don't know what they would have been referred to as back then. Here's a bigger rat tail file, and these guys were used to sharpen these enormously large saw blades. This is a fragment of one of those saw blades, and this guy, I don't know if it was every week or every day, the people cutting the trees would bring these saw blades to a shed or a shack and have the blades sharpened. So these were the tools that were used to sharpen this tool. Okay, so one of the coolest things that I like to find up at the camps are horseshoes. And I'll tell you why in just a minute, but some of these guys are very, very big. I'll put my head up next to that in comparison. They're just humongous. And these were used on the giant pack horses that would have hauled these giant trees to their destination. But we also find little ones like this. So the little guys, this even has some nails in there. The little guys we speculate would have been used for maybe mule or some type of smaller animal, but they really come in all shapes and literally sizes. So that little guy, and then we have this one that's really cool. I had not seen a shoe like that before. This guy has some of the nails in the side too, as you can see. This one's still loose. But I had never seen one with a closed circle like that. Maybe somebody can give us a shout out and clarify that a little bit. But we love the horseshoes because it just puts an animal face on all the work that happened up there, and that's pretty cool to see. Okay, let's talk about spoons. We find them quite often. Here's one that's kind of bent from the side. They're very, very fragile, so if you find one of these, you don't want to try to bend it back into shape. It'll just break right in half right there. But the ones that we find are the same ones. So they are camp issued. We find them all over the place, the exact same stamp, the exact same spoon, and in all different kinds of conditions. We believe that a lot of these are military surplus. Some of them may have been Civil War surplus. But the spoon is always cool to find because, you know, some guy had his stew with that spoon. Very cool. So even the pioneers had to get up on time, and this next relic is one of my favorite things that I think I've ever found at a pioneer camp, and it is an old alarm clock. And I'm gonna try to get it as close to the camera as I can so you can see the workings of this thing. The bell is still on top. The brass is still almost in one piece, and I think it stopped at 920 or 925. When we found this piece, it was really just a stunning thing to see sitting in the ground. When we pulled the dirt over, we'll show a little bit of that footage, and saw it laying there, it really kind of took your breath away. And before we cleaned the mud out, this had some of the original paper that had the numbers printed on there that are still almost legible. You can see a 5 and a 3. But even the lumberjacks had to get up on time. Okay, coolest find of the day so far. I just flipped over this plug and pulled out, keep it in focus, a beautiful alarm clock, it looks like, with a bell on top. And the glass is broken, but I'll have to be very careful with how I get that out of there. That's the back assembly, but that is an old alarm clock. Look at the old bell. The handle up here. Oh, it still works. The handle on top of the clock. Wow. Incredible. Hopefully it's got some mechanisms underneath this dirt. Oh, the glass is all broken. I better be careful. Very cool. Okay, this next piece was really exciting to find. River came up with it last year, and it is the bottom plate to an old cast iron wood stove manufactured by the Michigan Stove Company, as you can see written across the top there. Notably, these are heavy. A cast iron wood stove can weigh hundreds of pounds. If you've ever tried to move one or install one, they are not easy to do. So it really shines a light on how much effort it was worth to them in that day to get these stoves up the muddy roads and into the forests and not have a heck of a brutal winter. A couple weeks ago, we uncovered the corner plates to what we think is this same stove. They're really ornate, nicely done pieces of cast iron. And here's that other piece there. And they're broken. So it probably made from steel that wasn't super high quality. I think steel can get brittle in the cold or in the heat if it's not made correctly, or iron, or whatever the heck this stuff is. I'm not a stove expert. Okay, one thing that's awesome to find in the middle of all the rust and all the dirt and all the mud, you forget that they were people and they liked pretty things. That is a piece of a decorative porcelain cup that we found. We found the other parts of it, but they were kind of destroyed. But even in the middle of the mountains, when you got mud up to your rear end and ice and snow, they still wanted to have these nice comforts from home. So that kind of slows you down when you're digging, and reminds you that these were actual living people. Okay, so you're up in the mountains, it's very dark, there's no electricity, but you want to do some reading, so you pull out your oil lamp. And this, interestingly enough, has been the only oil lamp we found last year. And that has the brass components here. This is where the wick comes up here, and you would have turned that. And then down here, you would have either had a brass or a glass receptacle for the fuel. there is even some of the wick still inside of that can. But it's just, it would turn to dust if you tried to touch it now. So the oil lamp, very important in the dark in the mountains, in the night, in the dark. Okay, as you can see here, we have our buckle collection, and we find these buckles pretty regularly. So that's a belt buckle, and it's fused because it's rusted solid. And this is another belt buckle, which is brass, so it has not rusted and is still free. The tongue is still free in the buckle, but it's really, really cool to find a piece off of some guy's clothes that worked these areas so long ago. And along with the buckles, we also find suspender straps. And we find these pretty often. We got that style. Then we have this style, which is a little bit longer and narrower without the teeth. And then we have this one, which is so rusted, it's barely hanging together. Put that a little closer so you can see. But suspender straps always a really neat thing to look at from so long ago. Okay, another constant that we have referred to in a couple of our previous episodes is the Prince Albert in a can. We find these by the dozens. We can find 20 to 30 of them a day, which really puts the emphasis on what these guys were consuming. They either chewed or smoked a lot of tobacco, and we find these relentlessly. They've come to be just a kind of a plague when we try to dig more significant artifacts, but it's still a really cool thing to look at, and it puts some humanity on the workers of that era. Okay, so we were eating, we were smoking, and we were also drinking. Yes, this bottle is 1/5 of a gallon, commonly referred to as a fifth these days. It's an old whiskey bottle. We find a lot of bottles, mostly bottle fragments, when we search. I think a lot of these whiskey bottles were kind of set up for target practice. We'll find them with clear bullet holes in the sides of them, and that's a shame because these old bottles are really neat and they tell a story. So we find whiskey bottles like this. We also find old medicine bottles like this 3x11 that we showcased in one of our early episodes. And this specific bottle was sold by the glass manufacturer to independent pharmacists, if you will, of the day, who would fill them with their own medicinal concoctions and sell them in the camps to people for all kinds of cures. And a lot of it was just snake oil, but you needed any amount of comfort you could get when you're sick up in the mountains with no medical care. This one has a tiny bit of the cork still left in the top. Great bottle. Okay, by far, hands down, thing we find most of while we're in the deep forest are rifle casings, and we find all kinds of them. We have stacks and stacks and stacks of different types of calibers, different ages. I think this was from an episode we did in the winter. It's clearly a 50 caliber bear round. But the shell casings, if you didn't have your weapon, you weren't going to last too long up in these mountains. We also find the spent and impacted bullets. If you take a close look at that guy, you can actually see the ring of the backside of the lead and where it came in contact with whatever it hit. It's a really cool thing to see, just a big splat. So we find those quite often, but the guns were prolific, every caliber you can imagine. We find some old US military issued shells from 150 years ago. We find modern era shells, but we find at least 20 to 30 of them every time we go out.